and welcome to the Growth Whispers podcast, where everything that Kevin and Brad talk about is about building enduring great companies. That's what we spent a lot of time in our life studying and we're really passionate about. And not that we don't get a kick out of companies that aren't enduring a great, actually, we learn a lot from them. But our passion is helping founders, entrepreneurs, CEOs, leaders, executives build enduring great companies that sustain generations and perform amazingly well over time. And because we like it, it's what we like to do. It's what we like to study. It's what we like to share. So I'm Kevin Lawrence here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and with my amazing co-host, Mr. Brad Giles, down in Perth, Australia. Brad, how is it going for you today?
It's going very good. Good to see Kev. Hope that you are well. It's been a little bit of a while between chats for us.
Yes.
But I'm great. It is summer here, summer holiday time. Things are good.
Yeah, we're in the opposite end. It's a little cool here. We were away and had some sunshine, which was nice. But today we're digging into something interesting, which we're going to get to this thing called rules of engagement in a minute. But before we do, what's your word or your phrase of the day?
Relax. Yeah. Relax. I've just been on summer holidays, as I just mentioned.
I thought you were telling me to relax. No.
No, it's just relax. I'm feeling relaxed today. It's been a very good holiday break for me with the family. You gotta take time out to recharge.
Yes. Yeah, I just did the same where I had a few weeks to recharge and it was amazing and awesome. And yeah, although that's not my word of the day today. My word of the day is happiness. Was some time in Mexico and this amazing chef that we met in this unchef-like environment. But he talked about in Mexico, one of the core values is happiness. And it's a combination of gratitude and generosity. And it was the most beautiful definition of happiness I had ever heard in my life.
Wow.
And it just hit me. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's amazing.
So happiness is gratitude plus generosity.
Correct.
I love it.
Think about it. Gratitude, where you're able to soak up and absorb all the amazing things that are happening around you and take energy off the things that aren't. Just really appreciate what is. And then take that and share it with some other people. Share some of that with others.
Yeah.
Gratitude and generosity. It's a beautiful perspective. And as a side note, even this chef, his name was Noel. It was a fascinating guy. He talked about, if someone comes to my restaurant and they're hungry and they have no money, I'm going to feed them. Why wouldn't I? They're human. I want to help. Now, if they want a beer or they want some mezcal, which is like one of the drinks, the alcoholic drinks, like, well, no, they can pay. But if they need food, I want to help. Anyway, this guy was as much spiritual teacher as he was chef, and he'd made some amazing food. All right.
Beautiful.
So happiness and, did you call it rest? No. What would you call it?
Relax.
Relax. Okay. All right.
What a spiritual way. What a spiritual and nice way to start this episode.
Beautiful way. Wonderful. Well, let's dig into today. Today, we're talking about Collins in his book, Good to Great, has 3 rules of engagement for healthy teams. Now, we're not saying these are the 3 rules you must adopt. These are his recommendations, and we're going to share some more about it. So, Brad, why don't you kind of kick us off and give a little context to why the heck we should be thinking about this and why it's important?
Well, have you ever been in a meeting where it didn't go so well, or it was an ineffective meeting? I mean, we all have.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, I've been in so many of those. You want to poke your eyes out.
Yeah.
And not literally, because that would hurt, but it's like it's excruciating and you don't want to be there.
Yeah. And part of the reason is that there might not be a set of behaviors or a code of conduct that is effective that prevents those things from happening. And so in his analysis of In Good to Great, I think it was 1,443, I could be wrong on that number, but well over 1,000 companies in the Good to Great study, Jim Collins learned that these great companies had these characteristics in meetings that were common amongst them. And so there are these three primary things that kind of set the tone for any meeting that people are going to participate in. So that's what we're digging into today. What are those characteristics? Why do they matter? And how could you perhaps use this in your business to set the right tone or a tone of effectiveness for meetings?
Yeah. Or be inspired by it to come up with your own version of it, because it's kind of a starting point or a jumping off point. I remember, 5-7 years ago, we were at a strat planning meeting for a client in the US. I don't even remember what city we were in, but we're somewhere. And the CEO said, "Hey, I got a special thing for you." Actually, it might have been in Chicago. And he said, "Coach K is speaking." Now, some people call me Coach K. It wasn't me. It was Mike Krzyzewski, who is the coach of the legendary basketball team from Duke in the US. Now, he's since no longer at Duke. He's retired, I believe. But Mike Krzyzewski he's got an amazing track record. He coached the men's Olympic basketball team. And he was talking about building amazing, enduring teams. And, as he's telling his story about the first time he coached the men's basketball team, because he coaches a college team in the US, and he did very well. But he goes up, and it was the US men's basketball team is full of legendary players. And he said he's standing there, and he goes, "I'm standing there on the court." And he goes, "And then God himself walked onto the court," who at that time was Michael Jordan.
Yep.
And he's like, "What am I going to do with Michael Jordan and I believe Scottie Pippen, another NBA player? How am I going to tell them what to do?" Now, he was a very smart coach, and he knew, he couldn't, because that wasn't going to be the way that he could bring his best coaching expertise. He knew he had these incredibly talented players who were the best, and they knew they were the best. So his job was to actually blend them together, like an Italian grandmother does with an amazing pasta sauce. He had to bring them together into one amazing group. And he did it similar to what Collins talked about with the rules of engagement, except for he didn't make the rules. He got them all in a circle. He'd preceded the group a bit, and he had them come up with and make the list of the rules of engagement the team was going to have. This is the men's Olympic team. And what they were going to hold themselves and each other accountable to.
Awesome.
And according to the story, I think they came up with 12 things. And there was one was like, be on time. Another was respect the cleaning and caretaking staff, because a lot of people with a lot of power and a lot of ego could be disrespectful to a janitor or someone else. And one of the rules was, that ain't going to be us.
Yeah.
So the team came up with this rules of engagement, code of conduct, whatever you want to think. And then the team held themselves and each other accountable to it. So he didn't have to play parent to, and which is obviously the healthiest way. It's what we want as teams, but he facilitated it and helped to and we do this all the time. So we do with our own team, with our own retreat. We set our own guidelines of what we want to do. And even just today, I was just talking to a CEO about this, because he's got generally a fairly new exec team, and he's got a couple days with them at a special place. And we were talking about, how do you start off 2 days with your exec team, especially when they're fresh?
Yeah.
And again, these rules of engagement that we create, and then we find a way to follow up on it. It's an incredibly powerful mechanism to create team-based accountability instead of parenting by the boss.
Cool. So,
yeah.
So through his research in Good to Great, Jim Collins identified these 3 rules. So what we're going to do is we're going to, first of all, outline what are the 3 rules, and then we're going to dig in and explain what each of them mean. So first of all is brutal honesty. So it's incumbent on people to say the things that need to be said. Number 2 is no shame and no blame. We're not here to shame people. We're not here to blame people. And then, of course, number 3 is disagree and commit. So there would be in these teams, there would be very robust debate argument. People would be almost throttling each other across the table. But through that, they would, at the end, commit to successful execution. So let's spin it back. Again, brutal honesty, no shame, no blame, disagree and commit. Let's start at the beginning, brutal honesty. So confront the brutal facts. So we've actually done an episode on this. It's episode 59, Confront the Brutal Facts, Jim Collins' method for team hygiene. If you don't confront the brutal facts, if you don't step in at all times and say, what's the real issue here, or what's really going on, talk about the elephants in the room, whatever it is, all the way through your meetings, people can walk away saying, well, we didn't talk about this and we didn't talk about that. What a waste of time. And
that's true, because the brutal facts are the real issues that we don't need to talk about how our pencils just aren't the same brand they used to be, and how the paper clips they just don't hold their shape. Like that, I'm exaggerating, but there's a lot of stuff that's irrelevant. And as I say to, actually talking to the CEO about this today, for a mid-sized company, if it doesn't impact the business by about $1 million of EBITDA, maybe we don't talk about it because it's not brutal enough. It needs to be highly impactful. That's the filter would change based on the size of the company. But it's so easy to talk about the cursory issues and not the core issues. Interestingly, we pump this one up pretty hard in the work we do with companies.
Yeah.
We ask questions about it before we get in the room. We ping the team about this, and sometimes we ping the next layer down. If we're meeting with the execs, we get the execs to answer a bunch of questions before we enter the room, and then we would ask the directors as well. But that way, it gets rid of the social awkwardness of getting it on the table, because we've already got it in a body of data that we can pull from, number one. Number two, it's always an agenda item. What are the brutal facts?
Yeah.
And we flush them out. And as we get going with teams and build trust, we not only flush them out, we prioritize them, and we make sure. So I've got a meeting I'm going to tomorrow for 2 days. And all we're going to do is debate brutal facts for 8, 10, 12 hours a day. And I'll tell you more about that one later. But the main thing is the final agenda point is make sure there's actions connected to all of the brutal facts. That is how we wrap up the meeting before we say our nice closing comments, to make sure we've addressed them all. Because at the end of the day, we want to leverage our big opportunities and mitigate the brutal facts so we can be successful.
I had a meeting about 6 weeks ago, and standard agenda, quarterly planning workshop. Each agenda item was 20 minutes to 45 minutes. So it's all structured throughout the day, exactly what we're going to do. About 10 a.m., we started talking about the brutal facts, a structured agenda item, as you've just said. We finished at 4:50 because we had to close up because people had to leave. Yeah, it can be a really, really important, if we're talking about the brutal facts, it sounds simple, but it can be a really important thing. What's important here is we're talking about confront the brutal facts. This is a very slight deviation from that, which is brutal honesty. So when we set this as a code of conduct item for the meeting, or this is what we're going to do, it gives people license to be brutally honest. And they say, look, are you really being brutally honest about that item? Because I know you've got another perspective, which might be the real perspective. So totally agree with confront the brutal facts, but also this gives people, and I remember a meeting recently where an executive said, if I'm going to be brutally honest, this is what is really going on. And it just gives a license for those types of dialogues to be opened up.
Key point, it gives license. But I've been in meetings where CEOs are like, that's not the case. I don't know what you're talking about. That's not okay. You guys are idiots. This isn't going to work. I've had enough of this shit, blah, blah, blah. And the CEO loses it, which destroys any license that you give to that. And that's the key, is when these things come up, you have to handle it well, respect it, and be able to find a way to keep the conversation going. Otherwise, people get the message, yeah, he's asking for the brutal facts. He just wants the puffy facts.
That's where you need a masterful facilitator coach. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Like in that meeting, as that CEO started to lose it, I'm like, hey, we hear you, but let's get back to the question. Everyone in the room is terrified. I'm not. You can fire me. That's fine. We have a lineup of clients.
Yeah.
But it's where I had to manage him because he would have those and that shuts down the room. And that's the key. Even another company that I work with, we need that when there are two people on the team that love to fight, father and son, they like to have a good old fight. And as I've said to them, wonderful. Do it at home.
Yeah.
Do it outside the room. And we've learned in that company, because some people love to fight. Some people get clarity by fighting. And it's honest. But it's too intense for the room.
Mm-hmm.
So what we've learned to do is if it is, I'm saying, hey, excellent. This is important. Let's the three of us take it offline and we'll talk about it at lunch. Or like pulling it out of the room so you don't allow the room to be too toxic.
So a failure would be walking away from the meeting and anybody says, well, we didn't talk about this and we didn't talk about that. Now,
or holy, did we ever? And I'll never bring that up again. That's two ends of the spectrum. Two ends of the spectrum.
Well, that really is a great segue into our next point, which is no shame and no blame, right?
Yes.
We're not here to shame people and we're not here to blame people. We're here to build a great company. So we want a scientific debate with people engaged in a search for the best answers that is predicated by brutal honesty. Okay.
Yes.
So from good to great, this was a sentence that I loved out of that book. When you conduct autopsies without blame, you create an environment where the truth is heard. If you have the right people on the bus, you should almost never need to assign blame, but only need to search for understanding and learning. So this creates trust when we know, look, we assume that we've got the right people on the bus. We assume that everyone is here with the right intent. Therefore, everyone with the right intent, we're not going to shame others and we're not going to blame others. We're looking for the answers.
As long as you have a traffic cop who manages it when it gets a little off the rails, because it needs the traffic cop or facilitator. So I remember something where Jim said, I don't know if it's in one of the private sessions we did with him, one of his bigger workshops or where, but I think it was in one of his private sessions, and we did one in London with him, I remember, and he said, it might have been there, but what he said is, hey, brutal facts are awesome. And when you should do is prioritize the most important ones. But once you have one, you then need to gather the facts about the brutal facts. Don't drop into debating a brutal fact because you're going to have an opinion fest. Even when you're talking about the brutal fact, you need to then gather, here's all the facts that we know. So
facts,
we had a situation.
Opinions.
Exactly. Real facts. And then once you have the facts, and then you can debate it and come up with a solution. But that's like, it's a discipline to come up with the brutal facts. Then it's a real discipline to come up with the facts about the most important brutal facts before you start debating, because by nature, we like shortcuts and we go to opinion fest. So we had a situation in a company where the CFO, I loved the guy. He was a wonderful soul and he was not effective. And the finance team was no longer effective. So one of the brutal facts is there was about 3 of them on the flip chart we made at the beginning of the meeting about the finance team being ineffective. So I said, hey, I just heard this from Jim before, a few weeks before or something. I'm going to test this. This is probably the right time to test it because it's very sensitive because everyone loved the guy. And he knew he wasn't effective. So I said, well, let's do breakouts. And let's brainstorm all the facts about the brutal fact about the finance team not able to keep up, was the nice language I used. And people came up with all these facts, and we got 2 pages of facts. And then we were able to have a very constructive debate, and with the CEO in the room, then talk about solutions.
Yeah.
But there was it was a very safe conversation because it was facts. It wasn't judgments and blames and finger pointing. In the end, I mean, he also had to find a way to step up because it was undeniable. There was 47 facts on the flip charts, but it was almost like it was done with love and intent of helping the finance team give the business what it needed, because there was no shaming or blaming. It was just solving based on facts.
I remember another example. I was working with a team. They had a larger division and a smaller division. Probably the smaller division was, I don't know, 1/10 the size of the larger one, but it was losing money. And so we went into this quarterly session with this knowledge, saying, look, it's losing a lot of money. The profit from the larger division is paying, basically propping up the other one. What are we going to do about it? The leader of the smaller division stood up and he said, look, I take full responsibility for it. We're going to implement a plan, and using that brutal honesty, we worked to say, look, we're going to have to shut it down and do it in a coordinated manner unless we can come up with some Hail Mary very soon. Long story short, so we've gotten to that point. There was no shame and no blame on that leader for that being in that way. But fast forward 2 weeks, and then the finance team, where the CFO is on the leadership team, said, by the way, it looks like we've made some mistakes, and that division isn't actually losing that much money after all. In fact, they're making a small profit. It was terrible. It was disgusting. But during that meeting, that no shame and no blame, it was just honorable to be in there and see that person stand up, take responsibility. There was no shame or no blame passed.
What a test for them.
Yeah, it was a really, really good test. Anyway, moving on to the third rule: disagree and commit.
I love this one.
So let's zoom back. Well, let's just take a step back. We've got to be brutally honest. Number two, we're not here to shame people, not here to blame people. And we've got to have robust debates, tough arguments as a result of those first two, with building a great business at the end of that. Okay.
And by the way, Brad, that almost frames it up. Brutally honest allows us to get all the right stuff on the table. No shame, no blame allows us to process it and handle it and debate it in a healthy environment. And this one allows us to close it off. Like at some point, you can't debate forever. And at some point, there's a thing in Robert's rules of order. He's got to call the question. We got to, as quickly as we can, appropriately make a decision and move on.
And there's two bits. The first is that we don't want to have sham processes just to allow people to have their say. Like we want to have brutal, honest, no shame, no blame, people standing up, presenting facts, okay? But the second part is the worst thing you can do as a leadership team member is go 6 weeks into the quarter and say, Kev, I told you it wouldn't work, because it undermines the trust. It undermines the commitment and everything. So when we will disagree and we'll commit, there may be things that we decide on as a leadership team or as a team that you disagree with, but as a successful team, we commit to their successful execution.
Yep. And it's hard. Like in my role, I've got a CEO that we have a lot of debates. And there was one decision that they made, and I've just learned, I said, look, I am going to fight you tooth and nail on this decision because I do not agree with it at all. And once you decide, I'm going to support you on this decision with all my might. But man, it's hard, especially when you disagree. And I had a client, her name was Judy. She was my second client. This goes back in the mid-90s. Yeah. And she was a fiery, strong woman. I loved her. She was amazing. And I'm pretty fiery myself. And we were working through something and we couldn't agree. And she said that she was, Kevin, before I didn't know the concept. I just knew debate until you win. And she says, Kevin, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. I'm like, what are you talking about? We're not done. We need to debate this. And I just, because I believed I was right, and she just hadn't realized it yet. And she was, we're just going to agree to disagree. And I'm like, it was kind of relieving. It was like, okay, we admit that we disagree, but we're going to agree to proceed with, in this case, her idea. She was my client after all. And it's a very, very powerful I use it all the time.
Yeah.
It's like, I know so-and-so that, this is different than what you were thinking, but can you agree to disagree and be committed to this going forward? And they say yes. And when people are willing to say yes, it saves us from an extra 3 hours of debate. But the key is they have to be committed.
Yep.
Not just pretend committed.
Yeah. I had one issue. It must have been 3 or maybe 4 weeks ago. And we debated this particular subject for, it must have been an hour or an hour and a half. Fiery debate where people were retracting and they were stopping talking and then they were yelling. And so we got to the point and I'm like, right, are we committed? Are we going to do this? It's disagree and commit. And we went around the table. Yes, 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 no. And I thought we must have spent the last 20 minutes all on the same page saying yes. And I think it was the CFO, and the CFO said, no, this doesn't make sense. And then he commenced, he said, I'm prepared to disagree if necessary, but this is why I disagree. And he outlined it. The whole tables turned and we didn't do it. But the team needed to go through that debate. So yeah, disagree.
And it's healthy when it happens.
It was.
Because if it's enhancing your thinking and helping you to make a better decision, which is the intent of debate.
Yeah, indeed. Well, what a good
awesome
chat. Good chat today, Kev. Do you want to close it out?
The essence is some guidelines or codes of conduct. And Jim Collins gives you a great set to start with. Right? And and there's other ones that we've had, by the way. What's said in the room stays in the room. There's 17 other principles people have come up, but this is a hell of a foundation to set yourself up to win. And it's the essence of what people want in these meetings, to have healthy debates and to have a healthy team.
Indeed.
So brutal honesty, no shame, no blame, disagree and commit, all guidelines to help create a functional team. Last thing that I'll share. The key thing is, if you do this exercise and decide them, you need a mechanism to keep them top of mind. And I recommend putting them at the top of the weekly agenda as a reminder of the principles or the code of conduct that we use to conduct our meetings, so it gets operationalized. Otherwise, it was a one-time activity that gets forgotten and lost in the ether.
Indeed. Good chat. Brutal honesty, no shame, no blame, disagree and commit. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Of course, you can find us on YouTube if you're interested to see our smiling faces. Just search The Growth Whisperers. And you can find Kevin, and he's got an interesting weekly newsletter at lawrenceandco.com. And myself, of course, got a weekly newsletter as well at evolutionpartners.com.au. I hope you've enjoyed the episode and look forward to chatting to you again next week. Have a great week.